Hello, everyone. Great to be with you again for another episode of Palestine This Week with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, as always, a pleasure to see you and great to be with you again.
Thank you very much, Nasim, and it's always great to be with you again as well.
So, I had a series of questions in mind to kick off this week's episode. But the list of priorities has been overtaken by events after Israel crossed what many would say is a major red line by bombing Qatar, Doha, this afternoon, Tuesday. Apparently it happened with President Trump greenlighting the bombing. And the assassination the assassination attempt failed. That's what's been reported, and all senior leaders of Hamas have survived. So, I mean, I guess I want to begin with that and then move on to some of the other key topics I had in mind. So let's spend the first part of the discussion talking about that and just get your first initial thoughts on Israel crossing what, as I said, many would say is a major red line by bombing Qatar.
Yeah, and it crosses so many red lines in so many different ways. The news available at present is that 15 Israeli aircraft bombed a meeting of the Hamas negotiating team and political leadership in a residential area of the Qatari capital, Doha, adjoining the city's diplomatic quarter. Hamas has put out a statement that the leadership survived this bombing. We'll have to wait and see whether or not that statement is accurate. But it really raises all kinds of questions. Particularly telling is that the Speaker of Israel's parliament, who goes by the name of Amir Ohana, just released a video of the bombing with the caption, "This is a message to the entire Middle East." In other words, the entire region will be subordinated to Israel's will. Israel will do as it pleases, how it pleases, when it pleases, why it pleases, and you either submit or you die. Um, what's, I think, particularly noteworthy about this attack, and sorry, just to backtrack a bit. So during the past week, Israel has, of course, ceaselessly bombed the Gaza Strip. It has additionally carried out bombings in Lebanon, a series of bombings on multiple cities in Syria. As we discussed last week, it's also continued bombing Yemen and just took out much of the civilian political leadership in Sana'a. Just yesterday, it launched a drone attack in Tunisian sovereign waters on the Freedom Flotilla that was assembling there. And just today, now it has bombed Qatar. So we're clearly dealing with a lawless, rogue state. And the problem is that while everyone recognizes that it's a rogue state, it's not being made into an international pariah. To the contrary, it seems the more lawless it gets, the greater the support extended to Israel emanating from the West, and the more silence its actions are met with by states in the region. And there's, of course, a organic connection between the two, that the more impunity Israel is given, the more lawless it's going to behave. Now, I've often referred to Israel as the death squad state. And that reflects, I think, a deeper reality that Israel, for decades, has consistently operated on the principle that if it can just assassinate this leader or that figure or this politician or that military leader, that somehow its problems are going to be solved. Well, if that was an effective strategy, Israel wouldn't have been bombing Doha this morning, because what we find is that many of these movements have adapted to the knowledge, the certainty that Israel is capable of assassinating their senior leaders, and have put in place very flexible succession mechanisms to ensure that the movement remains coherent. Now, there's another aspect of this assassination or attempted assassination, we don't quite yet know, that I find particularly telling. And that is that negotiations are increasingly being used by Israel and the United States to lure people to their deaths. We saw this in September 1st in Beirut, where the late Hezbollah leader, Hassan Nasrallah, had come to a meeting in Beirut to discuss a ceasefire proposal that had been put forward to him, to Hezbollah. And it was at that meeting that Israel launched 80 tons of TNT at his bunker and managed to kill him and those with him. More recently, in June of this year, Israel and the United States used the US Iranian negotiations that were supposed to be convening in the Omani capital, Muscat, as kind of camouflage to launch their unprovoked war of aggression against Iran. And what we now have is that the Americans forwarded a ceasefire proposal to Hamas. It was actually a proposal that was formulated by the Israelis and then presented to the Palestinians as an American proposal. And it appears that they did so with the specific intention of producing a meeting of the Hamas negotiating team and political leadership to discuss this proposal, not so that they could proceed in the negotiations and get a response, but so that they could kill them. So negotiations have become not a method to resolve disputes, but rather a mechanism to kill people. The second issue, of course, is that this attack took place on the territory of a sovereign state, but more importantly, one of two states, along with Egypt, that is mediating talks between Israel and the Palestinians on behalf of the Americans to seek an agreement that would end this genocide in the Gaza Strip and produce an exchange of captives. So, it's it puts a whole new spin on the phrase "kill the messenger," and then of course there's a very important issue overshadowing this, which is that the United States maintains its largest military base in the Middle East. I believe perhaps even its largest military base outside the United States, in Qatar, the Al Udeid Air Force Base. And it's the regional headquarters of U.S. Central Command. And the relationship that many of these states have with the United States is the ultimate guarantee of their security and stability. Well, what we now have is that it's unquestionable that the United States was actively complicit in this attack. So, if the guarantor of your security is actually the one that is deeply implicated in an air raid on a residential quarter in your capital, that should raise some very serious questions. And if we talk specifically about Qatar, it has been attacked twice this year. First in June, when there was a Iranian missile attack on Al Udeid Air Force Base. It wasn't an attack on Qatar as such, but it was an attack that took place within Qatari territory. And now this. So it must heighten the awareness within Qatar, and I suspect also in the surrounding states, that unless Israel is called to order, unless it's muzzled, this rabid attack dog is just going to go on and on and on and form a fundamental threat to the national security and stability of the entire region. Think of it as not only a death squad state, but as a regional pyromaniac who's permitted to start fires whenever and wherever it pleases. So it raises all kinds of serious questions at all kinds of levels. And the fundamental question now is, we know that the United States, this administration, as with the previous Biden administration, will do absolutely nothing to restrain Israel. To the contrary, it will do everything within its power to enable Israel. We know that the Europeans, um, apart from statements at the rhetorical level, will also do nothing to restrain Israel, and to the extent that they are capable, will continue with the policy of business as usual. That means that the only governments capable of calling Israel to order are the Arab governments, or rather the regional governments. They are not in a position and have absolutely no intention of deploying military force to restrain Israel. So that leaves them with all kinds of other leverage. Will they, for example, sever diplomatic relations with Israel, whether we're talking about Egypt and Jordan, which have longstanding peace agreements with Israel, or the more recent Arab governments that have capitulated to the United States and Israel during the first Trump administration by normalizing relations with Israel without any kind of resolution of the question of Palestine. Will trade relations continue? Will security relationships continue? Will they use their influence in Washington to seek to compel Washington to restrain Israel? And if not, do they realize that they're going to be next, and that once Israel is done with them, we may see Israeli drones flying over Madrid, flying over Dublin, flying over Oslo. This is no longer inconceivable. This is no longer science fiction. This is reality in the 21st century.
Mm. You touched on a number of things, and the wider implications. I have a number of points and questions I want to put to you regarding that. What I found really jarring, I guess, is what you also mentioned, that the entire negotiation was just a ruse to gather Palestinians, the Hamas negotiators, to discuss peace, but with the intention of just to kill them. And that's, I guess, behavior more associated with medieval barbarians or Game of Thrones type of thing. You see
Or
on
gangsters.
gangsters, and not a civilized state behavior. But we are where we are. So I guess, I mean, the question, if you're Hamas leader or any leader for that matter, negotiating with Israel and the US, I mean, but of course, sticking with Hamas, I mean, so any illusion that Israel and the US were serious about negotiating a ceasefire deal throughout the past 2 years, it's now shattered. I mean, what now going forward? I mean, can you see any way of Hamas ever sitting down, or the Qataris, for example, giving the confidence to Hamas, or the Egyptians giving Hamas confidence to be able to sit down and negotiate, knowing now that the only reason knowing now that they could be assassinated anytime, or it could be a ruse for them to be gathered and assassinated in this manner?
Well, it goes beyond that, Nasim, because these negotiations have been a sham for almost 2 years. Everyone knows they're a sham. Those directly involved with them know they're a sham. These negotiations are essentially no more than a fig leaf to provide cover for Israel to continue its genocide while giving the appearance of seeking to negotiate an end to this crisis. But they're an absolute sham. They're designed, they're structured in order to continue indefinitely until Israel has achieved its objectives, or has gotten as close to achieving its objectives as it's going to get. The problem for Hamas is that well, there's two issues. The first is that the Egyptians and the Qataris, who are very close allies of the Americans, are not in a position to come out openly and publicly and expose these negotiations as a sham, and therefore have decided to continue with this charade. And with that being the case, Qatar is, rather, Hamas is not in a position to cease participation in this charade, because that would affect negatively the relations with the Arab state Qatar that has provided them safe haven, and the other Egypt, which controls the only Arab border with the Gaza Strip. So it's this kind of multi-dimensional charade that everyone knows is an exercise in smoke and mirrors, but for some reason, no one is able to come out openly and say the emperor has no clothes. So we will continue, praising his furs and silk.
I want to. There's a lot of I would say misinformation out there at the moment. So first, I read a number of reports saying that Trump was informed in advance before the strikes. And then Barak Ravid, the Israeli, he's the one who spread many of this, I would say, misinformation. He's an Israeli journalist, served in the IDF. And then just before I came onto this episode to record this episode with you, he said, no, Trump was informed just as Israel was dropping the bomb, as though Trump had no say in the matter. And now they will be forced to somehow salvage the situation and make it look like they were in control of everything that Israel has been doing. I mean, what do you make of that? The fact that Trump was
Complete
told
nonsense.
you don't believe him.
No, complete nonsense. I mean, I can't imagine that Israel would conduct an air raid so close to the main U.S. Air Force base in the Middle East without receiving a green light from Washington. More importantly, the Americans, of course, are on constant alert for the possibility of an Iranian attack. And so the Israelis would have had to have prior permission from the Americans so that their planes would not be engaged by U.S. air defense systems that are stationed in Qatar. So the idea that this was somehow not coordinated with the Americans is an absolute joke, and it's flat Earth society speculation. So there so that to me is clear as daylight. And of course, the Americans are not going to start applauding this given their relations with Qatar. So they put out the statement that, we were informed as the attack was underway, and that gives them plausible deniability. But it really needs no more than a second grade education to understand what's going on. There are additional reports, and I should stress these are unconfirmed reports, but reports nonetheless, that these planes may have taken off from the American airbase in Al Udeid. And there are other reports which contradict this, which say that there were British refueling jets stationed off the coast of Qatar. So, that raises questions as well about direct participation by Qatar's closest Western allies in this air attack on a residential quarter in its capital. We're now basically dealing with not only a death squad state, but a gangster state that is operating according to the laws of the jungle, and that is being actively encouraged to do so by its chief Western allies and sponsors. Now, the question becomes, um, do the Americans, do the Europeans really think that they can allow Israel to run amok throughout the entire Middle East, and that none of this is ever going to go beyond the borders of the region, that none of this is ever going to affect their own interests in the region? There's a wider issue here, which I started alluding to in the previous part of our discussion. Historically, Israel's sponsors, allies, and enablers um, only even consider changing their policy when their own interests in the region are directly under threat. We saw this most clearly in 1973 with the October War and the oil crisis, when the Europeans, for the first time, began to talk about Palestinians as human beings that might even have rights. So the real question for the Arabs now, and the region more generally, is, will they find a way to make clear to the West that the costs of your current policy are going to outweigh the benefits of continuing with a policy of setting the entire region aflame? And if, as I think is widely expected, the governments prove as inert in defending their own national security and their own fundamental interests as they have proven with respect to confronting Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people. um, how will Arab public opinion, how will disgruntled military officers in the Arab states, how will what remains of Arab political parties and movements respond to the inertia of their own rulers? And that's a dynamic that's not going to play out in the next 24 hours, but I strongly believe will do so in the coming months and years.
So the UAE foreign minister, he came out and tweeted and said that our solidarity 100% is with Qatar. Mohammed bin Salman, he said we place all our capabilities at Qatar's disposal. So there's been statements like that. Expectedly. Well, in Israel, Channel 10, there was a report that says that all these Arab Gulf states, of course, publicly, they have to come out and show solidarity with Qatar. They must do that because the public demands that, and everyone else demands that as well. But in private, they are saying, they're actually clapping their hands and saying, thank you for attacking Doha. I mean, what do you make of that? This idea that publicly they have to condemn this attack, but privately they're actually cheering this and clapping this. Of course, again, Israeli propaganda, Israel trying to go ahead, lead the narrative and make sure that how this lands well in the eyes of the international community. Of course, it won't. Of course, I think it will fail. But this idea that somehow the Arab countries are in private, or
Yes.
Gulf countries are in private, okay with this, it seems extraordinary. But this is the narrative that's been peddled in Israel.
Well, this has been a mainstay of Israeli propaganda for decades, that whenever anyone condemns Israel in public, Israel immediately puts out a report saying, actually, we're receiving passionately erotic love letters in private, so you can just ignore any condemnations directed at us. Of course, in some instances, that has been the case, that Arab governments feel compelled out of fear of their public opinion or for whatever reason or because of their bilateral relations with other Arab states, they feel compelled to publicly condemn something while privately being satisfied with it. That has happened, but it's not the rule. In Israeli propaganda, anyone condemning Israel is proof positive that they're actually supporting it. But that's not the reality. In this case, I think the situation is a little different. Qatar has had serious differences with its neighboring states, but those have been resolved a number of years ago. Hamas has been based in Qatar at the on the basis of explicit coordination with the Americans, because the Americans at the time that the Hamas political leadership broke with the Assad government in Damascus and left, believed it was better to have Hamas headquartered in an allied state like Qatar than in an adversary state like Iran or in Beirut, where Hezbollah reigns supreme. But Qatar, it's a member of the Arab League. It's more importantly a member of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and of course, it's a member of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So the idea that its GCC partners, its Arab League partners, its OIC partners are all kind of applauding this in secret, I think is pure propaganda, because they now understand that what Israel has done in Qatar, it is prepared to do anywhere and everywhere else. In fact, it's already proven it. So I think the real onus now is on the GCC and its members, particularly those like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain that have normalized relations with Israel at the expense of the Palestinians. How will they respond? Will they will their actions be limited to thoroughly meaningless condemnations and rhetorical statements, or will they seek to send a message to Israel this far and no further?
And if I'm an Arab state, I'll be thinking, not to give any concessions and to pull back any concessions like recognition that was granted to Israel under the so-called Abraham Accords. So, I mean, I bring this up because the UAE this week has come out and said that annexation for the UAE is a red line and could unravel the Abraham Accords. I assume with what happened in Doha today, that also is a red line, as you think it is, and as I and many others think it is a red line. And I think the calculation is shifting in the minds of the Arab countries, and specifically in how do we coexist with a country that is set on regional domination, and the idea that you can integrate Israel into a region without some kind of de-Zionization of the state has now been completely shattered or debunked. So, I mean, is that the kind of thinking that is taking place in Arab countries? That we tried, we did the Abraham Accords, but Israel continues to annex the West Bank. Now that didn't work. Israel is bombing our neighbors. Do you think they will now try and pull back or move away from the Abraham Accords as Qatar, as the UAE has suggested it may do, especially now given that it has also bombed Doha, and then looking at the future, that the only way we can coexist or accommodate Israel in the region is through some kind of de-Zionization of the state?
Well, we'll find out soon enough. I mean, it's the nature of such regimes who are, on the one hand, totally dependent on external powers for their stability and to large extent for their survival, and whose policies are fundamentally incompatible with the preferences of their own people. So, as we've seen throughout history, such regimes often even lack the basic instinct of self-preservation, and will go singing to the to the slaughterhouse. So we'll see. And I think the first test, as you suggested, is going to be how the United Arab Emirates reacts to the widely expected Israeli annexation of at least parts of the West Bank later this month or next month, particularly if, as widely expected, any Israeli declaration of formal annexation is met with enthusiastic U.S. support and European complicit silence. Will this red line once again prove to be invisible? Will Abu Dhabi actually be prepared to sever relations with Israel over this? Abu Dhabi's in a bit of a pickle because if you remember in 2020, when it first signed its normalization agreement with Israel, it claimed that it was doing so precisely to prevent Israeli annexation of Palestinian territory, which had been on the agenda but had already been taken off. So this was essentially the Emirati fig leaf for doing what it was going to do anyway. But now that annexation is very likely to happen, how will Abu Dhabi react? I'm not going to hold my breath. But if it does let this pass with either no consequences or symbolic ones that really don't affect the core of Israeli Emirati relations, this is going to send a wider message to the region that not only can your own leaders not be trusted, but they are working hand in glove with your enemies.
Mhm. Yeah, let's turn our attention now to Gaza. So I wanted to begin this show with this question about uh, new reports that came out last week. I think it was again The Guardian and Plus 972. They published a study showing that three quarters of detainees in Israeli jails and prisons are civilians. They're not actually fighters. So the vast majority are in these abusive prisons like Settlement. They're not even fighters. So this to me is further proof that Israel's war of annihilation is with the people of Gaza, with the Palestinians, and not Hamas. And not least because last week we spoke about this as well. Again, I think the Guardian, another study, showed that 83% of those killed by Israel were civilians. So this is further confirmation, isn't it,
Yes.
Mouin, that this is really not about Hamas or militants. This is really a war of annihilation of the Palestinians.
Yes. I mean, this is another scoop by Yuval Abraham, the reporter and filmmaker writing for Plus 972 magazine, who appears to have cultivated Israeli security sources who were willing to provide him with this kind of information, in coordination with another Israeli outlet named Local Call and the British Guardian newspaper. And what it reports is that Israel has detained and imprisoned some 6,000 Palestinians from the Gaza Strip since October 2023. And of these, only a quarter are considered by the Israelis themselves to be Palestinian militants. The others include an 80-year-old woman with Alzheimer's, doctors and medical workers, other civilians about whom nothing is even suspected. And the report then goes on to make the observation that it may well be significantly less than 25%, because, of course, Israel has released numerous Palestinians that it had initially classified as so-called unlawful combatants, not in the context of any exchange, but it just let them go because it had no further interest in them. So, if the figure of 25% is correct, we are to believe that Israel arrests people whom it knows to be militants or fighters, and then releases them out of the goodness of its heart. And then, of course, there's an issue that Israel has a very expansive definition of a fighter. So if that's taken into consideration, the numbers that are given in this article, as pointed out, maybe even higher in terms of the proportion of civilian non-combatants. Again, including an elderly woman with Alzheimer's, including medics, journalists, and all the rest of it.
Yeah, and Gaza City, of course, over the past week has been devastated, demolished. The last remaining buildings that were erect have been razed to the ground. What's the situation there? What's this phase of Israel's assault on Gaza? And of course, Palestinians from Gaza City are again being pushed down south. Egypt has expressed grave concern and fears that this is really the beginning of Israel seeking to push the Palestinians into the Sinai Peninsula. What has been the situation in Gaza City?
Well, Israel is now engaged in an operation it has called Gideon's Chariots 2. Gideon Chariots 1, as we discussed last week, has been determined to be a failure by those who were responsible for implementing it. And now Gideon's Chariots 2 is supposed to lead to full Israeli operational control and physical control over Gaza City, of course, the largest city in the Gaza Strip, the expulsion of its entire civilian population southward, and then the eradication of the Hamas forces in that city. Now, to give you an indication of the complexity of this operation, senior Israeli military leaders have suggested it could take up to 1 year for them to achieve this objective. But, while those are the enunciated objectives are objectives of Gideon Chariots 2, there's another one, which is basically to ethnically cleanse the entire northern Gaza Strip to make sure that none of the approximately 800,000 or so Palestinians in that area remain, and to reduce every last square foot of Gaza City to rubble, because a key strategic goal for Israel from the outset has been to make the Gaza Strip uninhabitable for Palestinians, to ensure that they are never able to return to their homes, and that Israel can therefore control the territory itself. So, we've already it's not going to be a walk in the park for the Israelis. And the question is whether they will be able to sustain this offensive for as long as they intend to, particularly as the military faces growing difficulties and the government faces growing political difficulties, and that will have to play out in the coming weeks. But we've already seen Israel engaging in a systematic campaign to bring down high-rise buildings in the Gaza Strip, and of course, all it says at the end is this was a Hamas building. For Western news agencies, for Western governments, this is good enough. Please continue, do as you please. But Israel's problem, of course, is that it orders Palestinians to leave. When Palestinians do leave, it bombs and kills them as they're leaving these areas. And then when they arrive to designated safe zones, it bombs and kills them there as well. So a very high proportion of the Palestinians that remain in Gaza City are either refusing to leave um, as a matter of principle, or refusing to leave out of fear of being killed precisely because they have left, or are refusing to leave because as bad as the situation in Gaza City may be, at least they're in their own homes, where the alternative will be to starve to death in overcrowded tent camps in the center or south of the territory. And as far as Egypt is concerned, it has now deployed some 40,000 troops on the border with the Gaza Strip. These are soldiers that are not allowed to be deployed pursuant to the Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement of 1979. But during the past several years, both Egypt and Israel have basically shredded that aspect of their peace agreement and deployed forces far in excess of what's permitted. And there's the Egyptian media, which serves as a mouthpiece for the government in Cairo, has taken an increasingly aggressive tone towards Israel. But there's also a strong feeling that Egypt wouldn't have deployed a single one of these soldiers without coordinating with Israel. So what exactly this means, we'll have to wait and find out.
Uh, Israel of course, has spoken about annexation, and this is something they're building up to. And I think we've been watching, waiting for a moment when Israel would, begin a systematic killing and destruction in the West Bank as well. And do you think it's now got the reasons to do that, following the killing in Jerusalem last week, the shooting which killed six passengers on a bus, and 21 others were injured? What do you think would be is going to be the ramification of that shooting? Do you think that will be the trigger for something bigger, a bigger campaign in the occupied West Bank?
Well, I think the response by Israel to that attack is going to be to intensify its pogroms and military campaigns in the Gaza Strip, to intensify and expand them. Regarding the specific issue of annexation, um, you know, everything Israel is doing has been on the books for a very long time, and was awaiting the appropriate opportunity. So if you look at annexation, for example, Israel, it's widely expected, will respond to the anticipated recognition of Palestinian statehood by a number of Western governments by formally declaring sovereignty over at least parts of the West Bank, perhaps even the entirety of it, but more likely sections of the West Bank. And the way this works, as it always has, is that Israel will take a symbolic step. It will gauge the response, and if the response is not decisive, then it will push further and further and further. So, what we've seen here is that for decades, the Europeans have said that Israel's implementation of the E1 settlement project, which we discussed last week, was an absolute red line, and that if Israel proceeded with this, it would have serious consequences for the relationship between Israel and the European Union. Well, recently, Israel went ahead and started implementing the E1 settlement project. The response from Brussels was a deafening silence. So Israel now understands that European warnings are pure rhetoric and not intended to be taken seriously and are not meant to influence Israeli conduct, because the overriding principle of European policy towards Israel is business as usual, and we will never, ever, ever do anything that could possibly damage our favorite child. So, what is interesting now is you may have a number of symbolic recognitions of Palestinian statehood that will then be used by Israel to formalize its annexation of these territories, in response to which the Europeans will do absolutely nothing to ensure that their symbolic recognition of Palestinian statehood has any practical meaning whatsoever. So the real test for the Europeans is, as always, are you just going to issue declarations, or are you going to implement policy?
On the two-state settlement, Macron issued a tweet just a few days ago saying that September 22 is when he will host a conference in New York for a two-state resolution with the Saudis, where they will issue a strong endorsement for the two-state settlement. So I guess if they were to do that, does that then not undermine Israel's efforts at annexation?
Not at
And
all.
okay, and if the annexation proceeds as Israel intends to, then of course that completely torpedoes the two-state settlement, does it not?
Yeah, look, declarations can have an impact on reality, but in this particular case, we're now more than 6 decades, if I'm adding up correctly, and or almost 6 decades into this illegal occupation, an occupation that has been declared illegal by the International Court of Justice last year. And if you're just going to throw words at it at this stage, it's absolutely meaningless. And it's made doubly meaningless because, under cover of these sanctimonious declarations, you're continuing with policies that enable exactly what you claim to oppose. It's just as with Gaza, um, uh, starving Palestinian children to death while ensuring Israel can do so with total impunity. Words have become absolutely meaningless, and have even more so have become an indication of exactly what's wrong with policy. So, um, these governments can say whatever they like, but unless they take actions that enables their words, that makes their words meaningful, you can safely ignore them.
I mean, Macron isn't really in a strong position to do anything
No.
at the moment, so who knows what's going to happen. Let's finish with the UK. The UK government, David Lammy, who is now, well, who was the foreign minister. So they issued a statement saying that the UK's position is that Israel is not committing genocide in Gaza. And that was in response to a question from the chair of the International Development Committee, Sarah Champion.
Of the House of Commons.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
So, to me, it was really surprising to see that statement, partly because over the past 2 years, the line, even from Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, has been that the determination of whether it's genocide or not is for the ICJ, not for the UK. So when it was convenient, that was the line that would be trotted out. But now, with the Israeli president coming to the UK and for various other reasons, they seem confident enough to say that Israel is not committing genocide. That's the conclusion of the UK government. So yeah, just your thoughts on
Yeah.
the U-turn. It's just quite extraordinary when everyone else, all the key experts on genocide have said that it meets the definition of genocide.
Well, actually, Lamy's letter goes a lot further than what you just said. It not only says there is no genocide, it also says there is no threat of genocide. Um, and the reason Lamy's letter invokes for making the absolutely outrageous claim that there is not even a threat of genocide is because for genocide to be genocide, of course, you need to be able to demonstrate intent. And what the letter says is there is no intent, there is no evidence of intent. Therefore, there is neither genocide nor even the threat of genocide. Well, the only person he needs to ask about this is his guest, the Israeli president, Isaac Herzog, who's arriving in a few days, and who in October of 2023 stated very clearly there are no innocent civilians. It's an entire society that's responsible, etc., etc. And Herzog's statements were in fact included in South Africa's initial submission to the International Court of Justice, seeking provisional measures against Israel in 2023. And this idea also that the International Court of Justice has said there is no threat of genocide. It said the exact opposite. It required Israel to undertake a number of actions and implement a number of measures precisely because the court had concluded there was a threat of genocide. And I think, the reason for this letter ultimately is because Britain is a signatory to the Genocide Convention. And if it were to recognize either a genocide or even a threat of genocide, this would impose clear legal obligations on the British government to change course and to, for example, stop with its intelligence overflights over the Gaza Strip, which are directly assisting Israel's genocidal military with its targeting and so on. So this is really, an absolutely outrageous document composed by lawyers for the purpose of maintaining business as usual. And then, the Labour Party wonders why it's vanishing in the polls.
Of course, there's also the issue of 900 people being arrested for protesting
Yes.
peacefully. So I think we'll get to that next week. There's a number of other
Yes.
topics I wanted to ask you about, but let's end there. I mean, just because we did speak a lot about the bombing in Qatar, and this is fresh news. A lot will change over the next couple of days. A lot of details will come out. Is there anything specific you'll be looking out for? And I mean, indications to suggest that we may be entering into a new Middle East, because it is for many a major red line that's been crossed. So what do you think? I
Well,
mean, what
look,
would we be looking out for?
on October 7th, when Israel, in the immediate aftermath of the Hamas attacks, began its genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip, um, regional governments were silent. And one could explain this by saying, Israel was attacking Hamas, a movement that was that did not have good relations with most of the governments in the region. This was an attack on Hamas and not on the Palestinian Authority, which is a member of the Arab League, and so on. Then, when Israel began to attack Lebanon, you could say, well, it was attacking Hezbollah and not the Lebanese state, and so on. But what we've seen is, then you had Yemen, then Syria, yesterday Tunis, today Qatar, of course, Iran in June. And Israel is addicted to expanding wars. And every time these regional governments seem to find yet another pretext, yet another excuse to play dumb, to look the other way, to stay silent, to pretend that they're not going to be consumed by this fire. They're literally marching to their own deaths suicidally while singing uplifting songs. And the question becomes, will they at any moment, do they even have an instinct for self-preservation? And if not, will their absolute lack of policies designed for self-preservation cause others to feel they need to be replaced?
Mm.
So,
And
sorry, just
yeah.
to get back to your question, if I may. I mean, the two things I would look for in the coming days is, will the official Arab state system non-respond yet again? And then when you look at those who feel they are also in Israel's crosshairs, I'm thinking of Iran, I'm thinking of Hezbollah, and so on, will they feel that this time they can also afford to wait and absorb the first blow, which they must surely know is coming? Or will they feel, that if we don't do anything to deter Israel, it's going to get even worse for us?
Yeah, and I think Arab states have are in this mind of wishful thinking that somehow this Israel will solve itself. I don't think it can. I'm more persuaded now than ever before that until there is de-Zionization of the state of Israel
Yes.
and de-radicalization of Israeli society, this idea that this is land given to them by God, this is not minority view, this is majority view in Israel.
Mm.
Unless you de-Zionize, de-radicalize, I don't see how they can accommodate this country. So
Mm.
why they haven't reached that conclusion just
Mm.
beggars belief, but that's the conclusion they need to reach and change their policy
Yes.
accordingly.
Yeah, and if I may, I think what needs to be recognized is that Israel is an ideology with a state. It's not like Denmark, it's not like Peru, it's not like Thailand. Israel is an ideological project. Israel is the political expression of the ideology of Zionism. And so you can't deal with one without first addressing the rotten core of the other.
Thanks, Mouin. As
Thank
always,
you.
pleasure to speak with you and see you all next week for another episode of Palestine This Week. Bye-bye.